Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. With a worldwide death toll of 163,000, of which 40,000 are Americans, Congress is eyeing another $300 billion stimulus package for small businesses as world markets rebounded on the promise that the world is turning a corner on the pandemic and can reopen for business soon. Despite the crisis and staggering casualty rates, states and governments are looking forward to cautiously easing restrictions, and U.S. airlines now have a bailout package as Boeing reopens its plants in Washington and Pennsylvania. The Chinese government announced that its market will contract by 6.3%. Joining us as they do every week is our panel to discuss the week on world markets, Dr. Rocket Ron Epstein of Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Sash Tusa of the independent equity research firm Agency Partners in London, and Richard Abalafia of the Teal Group Consultancy. Guys, welcome back.
Great to be here, Vago. Thanks.
Thanks, Vago. Good to be here.
Thanks for having us on, Vago.
Always a pleasure. Before we get started, our global coverage is sponsored by Leonardo DRS. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and our broader cyber coverage. Fincantieri Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage. And of course, Bell sponsors this podcast. Ron, start us off. It was an upmarket week, buoyed by word that governments are going to be easing some stay-at-home restrictions, and even that Oxford University may have identified or has a promising take on a vaccine for coronavirus. Where were markets heads this week? And more broadly, what were sort of the most important storylines for you?
Yeah, so the market closed the week up on a very strong week last week, right? So last week was the best week the market had since 1974, and then this week followed up on that. On Friday, the market rallied very strongly on exactly what you said, expectations that we'll start to see some opening up. There was some news on a treatment by Gilead called remdesivir, and that sort of buoyed the market as well. So across almost every industrial sector, we saw, or not just every industrial sector, across every sector, we saw the market rally on Friday. It was an interesting day for Boeing on Friday because the shares rallied with the market, and on the news that they were going to start production again this upcoming week out in Seattle. However, on Friday, also GECAS canceled about 70 of their 737 MAX orders. I think it was 67 to be precise. If you add it all up, that's just under 10% of the 737 backlog cumulatively that's been canceled so far. And who knows, there might be some more coming. When you look at some indicators about how the broader economy is doing, oil this week was also quite weak. There was a period on Friday where we saw West Texas crude well below 20. It was in 18 and change kind of range. And what oil tells you at these levels is there's just not much demand for it. I mean, obviously, for one reason, there's not a lot of travel on the roads, but also just the global economy right now is really slow. And I think one of the puts and takes that's going on in the market is when things start to open up, that's a positive, but we're also rolling into what's probably going to be a global recession. And then how does that recession clear up, and what's that mean for the markets? One of the things, and I think one of the more important things to keep an eye on as we roll into this week and next week, will be earnings season. We're starting to see earnings come out. We saw earnings for the big banks come out this past week. And I think broadly, they did a little better than what people were thinking. But we'll start to see this week some industrial names and some names that are more specific to aerospace and defense world report, and we'll see what that means.
Stash, let me bring you in. Obviously, a lot of storylines going on. Ursula von der Leyen, the European Union president, apologizing, for example, to Italy for the EU's rather slow response. The Johnson administration being criticized for its response on coronavirus. Discussions about whether London and Brexit should be delaying. London and Brussels should be delaying Brexit talks. And then there's the broader monetary story in Europe. What were sort of the most interesting storylines for you this week?
To cover off on some of those, I think the EU recognizes that it has done itself a disfavor in Italy. 80% plus of Italians think worse of the EU now than they did 2-3 months ago, because there was a feeling that the EU did not come in and help Italy, which after all was very much the first European country to go into this crisis, and has still got the highest death toll. I think Ursula von der Leyen, apologizing was good politics, very, very sensible, and she's a very impressive lady. I think she's a much better defense minister in Germany than I think most people give her credit for. Is it going to change the broader Italian relationship with the EU? Not very much, I fear. I think as far as the UK is concerned, it's very evident that while Boris Johnson is still recovering from his own attack of coronavirus, the UK government's pretty leaderless at the moment. There's a quadrumvirate of senior ministers who basically take it in turns to head up the various briefings. Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, is acting as the First Secretary of State, but very, very hard for any of them to step up to the plate and actually make major decisions until Boris Johnson comes back from convalescence. And a lot of the evidence is that could be a couple of weeks yet, and that is affecting the UK government's response. That probably indirectly is why there is this talk about whether the finalisation of Brexit should be delayed. Technically, it's there's supposed to be an agreement by the end of June, and then the UK and EU agree the trading agreement by the end of the year. That's looking at a really aggressive timetable, frankly. The problem is that it is politically very, very difficult for the UK government at the moment to ask for an extension, and it's impossible while Boris Johnson is not well. So we'll see on that.
And also expensive, right? I mean, the longer Britain stays, right? I mean, there would have to be payments, especially at a time when the EU is preparing a lot of bailout packages.
I don't think anybody's looking at the cost remotely at the moment. I mean, that right. Money is just flowing out of every exchequer in Europe at the moment. Genuinely, a few tens of billions here or there doesn't even get noticed politically, and probably doesn't even get noticed by the bond market at the moment. Bond market will worry about the differentials between the various European budgets and so forth, probably a year down the line. But at the moment, nobody gives a monkeys.
When you're in a world where there's $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there, what's really a few billion?
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Exactly. By the way, somebody's going to have to work very hard to beat quadrumvirate. I think that wins the word of the podcast. I'm ready to put that out on the table, although everybody can aspire. Richard, you had a tremendous brief. I believe you called it sort of a market assessment of where we are. The way you put it is like going off a cliff just without the view. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what it's like to go over the cliff in a barrel in this market?
Yeah, it's not pretty, and I'm going to challenge Sash with using the quintumvirate, but I'm sure there's at least, I'm pretty sure there's one after that too.
Richard, that's just gratuitous, and you know it.
I'll take it. If it's gratuitous, but it gets a belly laugh, I'm taking it. There are so many factors right now that are simply like, oh my God, we've never seen numbers like this. People at first, of course, were comparing this air travel crisis to something, SARS, then 9/11, then, I don't know, World War II. It now bears absolutely no reference to anything, I mean, even after 9/11, which was the worst traffic drop we've seen in many decades, when everything was finished at the end of the year, we had lost about 3 points in traffic. That was not pretty. This year, if we make an amazing fourth quarter recovery due to some combination of miracle drugs, herd immunity, and antibodies, and some gimcrack cure being promoted by whatever political leaders, then we're still 48% year over year off in terms of traffic. And that's with that miraculous fourth quarter miracle. More likely we'll be 60, 70% off. This bears no relation whatsoever. So, like we were discussing before about the reopening of the Boeing plant, you have to wonder, like, this is not like the defense industry where people are cranking out stuff again, like in Boeing's Philadelphia plant for, a customer, a market that still exists, a customer that's still paying. What exactly is the end market for commercial jets right now when well over half the fleet is parked and we're at least in a 50% reduction in terms of traffic? This market has simply failed, and it'll take at least a few years before we get back to where we were following the discovery of whatever combination of post-infection and pre-infection prevention and cures we can come up with in the world of medicine. Until then, this enormous business of building jets with the giant ecosystem behind it is effectively borderline crippled. So we're looking at the impact of that, and it's obvious that you look at the history of cyclical downturns, and again, there's not a lot of guidance for this sort of contingency or a series of contingencies. Typically you get about 40% off in terms of peak to trough, but that bears no relation to what's going on now.
Let me ask you guys, right? I mean, we now have a bailout package, as everybody noted. Boeing is looking to increase production, obviously restart production, whereas Airbus has cut dramatically its production rate. In the conversations that I've had with CEOs, but also with government leaders, including Navy Acquisition Chief Hondo Geertz, one of the points he made was, we may have been traveling too much, that we feel that we're actually being very, very effective in getting work done. That even though 97% of his team is now working remotely, they're accelerating contract awards. They are, getting quite a lot of work done at a foundational level. His point was that years of back end work on how to make things more efficient are paying off. But one of the other things he said was, maybe more people were traveling than they needed to. Maybe that we could do a lot of the meetings we were doing remotely. He also added that we're also finding that maybe you don't have to send 15 inspectors to a ship, that actually one inspector will do. We find CEOs telling us things very similar. It is very important to travel. It's important to get out there to see and be seen. On the other hand, maybe we were overdoing it before. Do we have any sense whether or not some of the things we're seeing will be the changes in this, right? It's going to come back, but that it actually might come back somewhat differently?
I find, if I may, I find the whole idea so bizarre because it posits a world where there are zero competitive threats. In other words, you're trying to make something good in the midst of a crisis. I understand why you'd say that, why you'd think that, why you'd act on it. I agree completely. We're all trying to make the most of homeschooling our children or whatever else. But then the real world comes back. And I'm hard pressed to think of somebody outside of the government, maybe outside of a few people in Navy procurement, who don't have a competitor. And the idea, well, Ron, last I checked, you had competitors in the world of equities analysts. Last time I checked, I had competitors in the world of aerospace consulting. And the idea that I would cease to go to fewer client visits or conferences, and that there would be other people who I compete with who go there instead, and I would therefore simply lose market share because I feel like traveling less. That's what real commerce looks like. In other words, I can only see it as a short-term measure and for more of frankly, a bit of a government mindset.
But does that apply to people who are in very competitive places? Right now, you could argue that there are a lot of government people who are going, and industry folks who are going around to meetings that maybe they could have done with either Zoom or any other app. I want to get sort of Sash and Ron's take on it also. But
if let me jump in quick. In my business, ultimately, there's nothing that can substitute for person-to-person communication. The reason this paradigm works for me now is I've met all these people before, right? So could you imagine a world where what we're doing now supplements travel? Sure, okay, I give it to you. But I fall firmly in Richard's camp, where I remember after September 11th, and there's all this, we won't fly again. My sense is once there's the epidemiological challenge of the current situation is met, people will travel again. This is an industry that for many years grew a nice proportionality to global GDP. It was an industry that grew something like just under 5%. Those of us who have followed it for a long time in recent years started to question that because it was growing more than that for a while. And maybe the proportionality between GDP and air travel was somehow modified or different. But nature has a funny way of working things out, and we came to a screaming halt, and we've reverted to the mean in a very violent fashion. But ultimately, this seems like an industry that'll grow like just under 5%, and I don't have any reason to believe that won't be the case. One of the starker realities of this might be, we're set up that we can work remotely, that our workplace will want us to travel and work remotely. So I don't know. I fall in Richard's camp, and I really don't see travel being replaced by anything unless something like a transporter, a la Star Trek were to occur, which would be a different form of travel. But until there's a true substitution for aircraft, something can get you from A to B in a different manner, we'll still be going from A to B.
And I want to say, I don't think anybody is saying that they're being exactly as efficient or as, I don't think anybody is saying that they are as productive. But, when it comes to major contract awards, certainly that's the message that the Navy has been putting out. Sash, let's get your sense on this as well, because I know you've been having these conversations with clients and companies as well.
Yeah. A couple of sort of small data points. Several of the European defense companies have already highlighted that order flow was down at the end of the first quarter and will be down in the second quarter because they could not travel to seal the deal, and their customers, who are typically governments, would not sign without a handshake. Which is, we may argue that that's all terribly 2019, but that I think is going to be one of the sort of glitches that we see at least through this year as people get used to doing stuff differently. I do rather agree with Richard that in any competitive environment, which is exactly what we are all in and are all talking about, nobody will take the risk of not traveling and praying that their competitors also don't travel. That's just not going to happen. I think though the broader issue of air transport demand, we and frankly the industry has to accept that a 40% plus decline in traffic this year has permanently destroyed value and has permanently destroyed the ability of airlines to respond and the price at which they can provide seats. And I suspect that in a year's time, there will be some fewer airlines, that other airlines will be operating very inefficiently. There are proposals at the moment in Europe that airlines should leave the middle seat free to enable there to be some social distancing. Well, that is just going to kill the economics of any short-haul airline. Because you've just lost a third of your load factor in one fell swoop. So, is there demand for new civil aircraft at the moment? No, there isn't. If Boeing and Airbus didn't produce an aircraft for somewhere between 2 and 3 years, the industry would come back into equilibrium over that period. The problem is that they have to keep on producing aircraft, or in case of Boeing, to restart producing aircraft with the MAX, because their systems cannot function by taking a 2-year break or whatever. So there's going to be oversupply, and that's going to cause, I think, the indigestion in this industry to go on for much longer than it otherwise would do.
Speaking of antacids, is the amount of money that Congress has made available and the amount of financing that is out there sufficient for these airlines, Ron?
I think what you've heard from most of the airlines is it'll help them for a couple months, and then maybe it's not, right? So it gets back to probably one of the most bedeviling questions of this whole situation is the duration. And I think one of the broader economic questions that we don't fully understand yet, and to be candid, is probably well beyond my pay grade to sort out. As we get through this, as things reopen, what's the recession going to look like? Right. So it's not only it's not like the virus goes away and we're back to some happy normal. The virus starts to
right, because
and then we have to deal with a recession.
Right. Well, because time and again, right, we've seen places say, hey, we've turned the corner, whether it's Singapore or China or anywhere else, and then we lift these restrictions, and then all of a sudden we find ourselves, with another flare up.
Exactly, right. And I think if you go back and you look at the Spanish flu in 1918, it was actually the second wave was worse than the first wave.
Right.
So not to be a bearer of bad news, but once we get through the first wave, it's it's not all clear yet, right? So there's so many unknowns about the duration of this that it's very hard to say, and it makes forecasting in this environment very, very difficult. I mean, it's perfect for scenario analysis, and you can go through different scenarios, but which scenario do you pick? It's a very hard question to answer.
Richard?
This is clearly just a question of the V rebound, the U rebound, and all of this depends upon the epidemiological realities, just like Ron says. I mean, I think a lot of people predict a V because past precedent says V. But boy, when you talk to people who actually have medical degrees and stuff, they seem to be indicating something different. So I'm a little concerned we have an economic survival or recovery package that's geared towards a V that is not based on likely medical reality. And so this gets back to what Ron said, what is the recession like coming out of this? It could be everyone is, nicely prepared for the next 3 months. They're tucked in and ready to get through the medically induced coma that the economy is in, to use Paul Krugman's term. But what if this is more like an 18 to 24 month story, courtesy of, the lack of an effective treatment or vaccine, coupled with the recession, in which case, the government is finding itself feeding intravenous fluid into the patient, that is the economy, for a lot longer than expected. And then it gets beyond economics, but into the world of, mega economics. Just, what is it like when you have to keep a $20 trillion economy going with a great deal of government money? Do you go from, 29% of, debt to GDP to something much higher, beyond World War II levels? How long is that sustainable? How many other countries do it the same way? Can we survive this? Or is it fine? Because, frankly, if we're all doing the same thing at once, even the Germans and the Japanese and other fiscally conservative countries like, in Europe, then maybe it doesn't matter as much. How long can we bear this debt load? There are big questions. But getting back to the central point, these sorts of packages seem long enough for a V-shaped recovery that is unlikely to happen.
I was just going to add, right? When you think about this downturn, it is the mother of all downturns, right? I mean, this is the most severe downturn in aviation history, I think, through all of aviation history.
Right.
Nobody ever dreamed that you would see U.S. traffic flows, if you want to, like we mentioned in previous podcasts, but 90,000 people going through the TSA when it should be 2.5 million, that kind of thing. So what's very, very different from a financial perspective about this downturn? In previous downturns, companies still made money. If you're in the commercial aerospace business, that business probably will not make money this year. If you're a diversified manufacturer where you have a defense business or other industrials, that could very well help you out. But typically in a downturn as a supplier, things would get tighter, things would get worse, but you wouldn't just lose money. This time around, if you're exposed to commercial aerospace, it's worse than it's ever been. And that's why you've seen valuations in the market in this group bounce all over the place, because it's from a financial impact and just from a fundamental impact, it's like nothing we've ever seen before.
Sash?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that this is The only downturn that comes close was actually the recession at the end of the 60s and into the early 70s, which was caused by effectively the first massive jet re-equipment process, which came to an end and led to a glut of aircraft across what was then a very, very small airline industry. And that meant the production rates didn't return to their previous peak for 7 years. That doesn't seem to me to be an unrealistic assumption, frankly, based on this. Just to be clear, we think Airbus falls into loss next year, doesn't make money in 2022 either, and does not get back to the level of profit it made last year within our forecast period, which is the middle of the decade. That's how serious we think this is.
And now a word from our sponsor. The Defense and Aerospace Report is brought to you by the Bell V-280 Valor, bringing the mission technology of the future to the battlefield of today. Visit bellflight.com for more. What does all of this mean for Raytheon now that some of these numbers are a little bit clearer and it went from being a pure play defense contractor into being what is in mixed territory? Richard, do you want to start us off on that? Because you did have their performance highlighted and want to get your guys' take on everybody's take on that as well.
Yeah, first of all, I think you've got to look at the broader strategic factors that help create Raytheon Technologies. And as a consultant, like many consultants, I would have said to Raytheon, "Hey, you're a pure play defense company, but you got to look to the commercial sector for long-term growth. And so, because of that, it's better to be balanced." And even though you don't have a lot of synergy, it's balancing your portfolio and harnessing the power of commercial compound annual growth. Great idea. And of course, just a couple months later, now it's, oh my God, you're so much better off as a pure play defense prime because the commercial world is going to hell. And, you can almost see that on a tactical level, this is just colossally ill-timed from the standpoint of people in Massachusetts, and incredibly well-timed from the standpoint of people in Hartford, Connecticut. Again, you got to take the long view, and in the long view, having that balanced portfolio, that combination of commercial compound growth and the security of defense is a pretty good way to run a company.
I couldn't agree more with Richard, right? I mean, the whole premise of this was, the balance between the two and the possibility of engineering synergies between the two. For all the reasons you want to do that, you're seeing it play out right now, right? So, we didn't know that the virus was coming, but having that balanced portfolio, Raytheon Technologies won't have to seek government funding on any level. They'll probably still have a dividend going forward. I would imagine they cut back on their buybacks, just if for no other reason. Politically, that's more palatable in today's environment. But a lot of the stressors that are hitting other companies that are primarily commercial aerospace, I guess a thought experiment is, what if United Technologies had not done the deal? How much pain would they be in today? They'd be in a lot of pain. And as a result of doing the deal, they're not. And vice versa. I mean, roles will reverse, things will change over time. So I couldn't agree more with Richard in terms of the balance that this brings to the portfolio. And ultimately, from an investor perspective, for those investors who do want to get some exposure to commercial aerospace, but want some downside protection of the defense business, Raytheon Technologies couldn't be positioned better for that.
Sash?
If you have a choice between doing a deal like this, which is going to make Raytheon Technologies, a survivor and almost certainly a winner, compared to carry on as two independent companies, do lots of share buybacks, and then suddenly find that your balance sheet is totally ill, or one of your company's balance sheets is totally ill prepared for the downturn. They've done the right thing.
Let me ask you guys about China. Obviously, nobody believes the Chinese figure of 6.3%. Everybody thinks that the number is going to be a lot worse. How do you see this going forward? Because China has been doing, as we have discussed on this program, sort of a great global PR wins. But now they're increasingly being counteracted by rounding up Hong Kong protesters, raising the fear that that Chinese forces might actually go into Hong Kong if there are widespread demonstrations. a lot of frustration directed against China about having misrepresented the crisis in the first instance, reporting that, for example, this could have been a virus that escaped a lab, certainly not a biological weapon, but a sort of poor processes may have caused this virus to get out there at a time when the Chinese are still being very, very aggressive, whether it's a confrontation with a Malaysian drill ship. Talk to us about how you guys sense what are the global economic impacts here of that? Because China has been on the commercial aerospace side of things, but also on just the regular trade side of things, among the most important trading nations for, it's what's allowed a better standard of living overall because stuff has been less expensive and made in China. But where do we end up in even a year's time? And what are the implications of that?
Let me jump. Sash, you
go. Thanks. Bearer of bad news. I think China's winning from this. I think that the narrative out of China, and to some extent it's supported, is they were first into the pandemic and they're pretty much first out of the pandemic, and they'll probably recover quicker because less of their economy was shut down for a shorter period of time, certainly than we're seeing in Europe and probably than you'll see in the US. That's just relative, but I think also the degree to which the US and Europe are so massively politically distracted by dealing with coronavirus at the moment that we are completely incapable of challenging the Chinese in the Pacific and Southeast Asia means that the Chinese are going to get away with more over the next, now 6-9 months out than they would have done before the virus. And after that, we need their orders. We need their business. Boeing definitely needs orders from China. Airbus needs orders from China. That is going to absolutely cripple the ability of the US and Europe to restrain China and to come up with some sort of strategy against China, whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative or broader political issues. Hong Kong at the moment, does anybody care about Hong Kong compared to the death toll in their particular country? It really is a minority, I fear.
Ron?
Yeah, I guess my take's a little different than Sasha's, and maybe it's because we're on different sides of the Atlantic. What you see here is, I guess, the graciousness, the soft power that China was putting forth by shipping medical gear to different countries. There was immediate pushback when a lot of that medical gear was seen as being faulty. So that which was potentially a soft power win had a lot of blowback, and it's not just from one or two countries; it's multiple countries. I think one of the bigger economic things that's going to play out of this is countries are going to see that there's going to be, because of national security concerns, and let's throw under national security just not the typical what we talk about every day, but times of war, emergency, pandemic, there's going to be a focus on that in the supply chain that must be made domestically. Inputs to pharmaceuticals, other healthcare equipment. Who would have thought, 6 months ago that an N95 mask would be seen as, sort of a critical infrastructure, the thing that you have to make yourself. There'll probably be a lot of policy thinking, my guess would be, after this, on what is deemed critical supply chain. And beyond the scope of what we were thinking was political supply chain from a just kind of pure defense perspective just, 3-4 months ago. And those supply chains will be renationalized. And I don't think just in the US, but in other countries too, that having this reliance on other countries and potential countries that are seen as competitors will not be seen as suitable. And I think in some ways there'll be a broad rewriting, if you will, of the rules and lines around globalization and globalism. And not that globalization and globalism is going to go away, but there'll be a focus on, maybe that is something we should do. internally because that's important for our country. It's hard to imagine that won't happen, and that's going to have economic consequences, both for China, outside China, and potentially other countries in Asia that will be seen as diversification away from China as other low-cost places to do business. A case in point that I would throw out there would be Vietnam. It's hard to see Vietnam not being a net winner out of this, given their positioning vis-a-vis China and how friendly they are with the US. But anyway, that's my thoughts.
Richard?
Yeah, I 100% agree with Ron here. It's hard to see that, yeah, I mean, the Chinese government basically did not miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, whether it's the soft power that resulted in faulty test kits and whatever else, to taking advantage of the Trump administration's own stumbling around blaming China. It just looked like two, one wannabe authoritarian and one, yes, absolutely authoritarian regime not doing a very good job. And I don't see how they win from this. Now, in terms of globalization and its rethinking, I completely agree with Ron. It just, the world is too complicated. The economy is too complicated. Industrial arrangements and supply chains are too complicated to say, okay, renationalize, bring it all home. Instead, there's going to be some rethink, maybe a bit more regionalization. Maybe Europe will say, well, really the answer is more Tunisia and Morocco rather than China. And the US might be looking more to Central America, Mexico, and yes, potential strategic allies, even like Vietnam, rather than potential strategic adversaries. So not an end to globalization, but rather a rethink. That makes perfect sense to me.
Sash, let me round this out with a question for you on the Strategic Defense and Security Review. The UK's every 5 years, sort of the British version of the American Quadrennial Defense Review. Give us your sense on where that's going to be, because your expectation was that was going to be delayed.
Yeah, the Strategic Defence Review is pretty much in the same situation as Boris Johnson at the moment. I mean, it's in convalescence. Probably not even that. It's been delayed indefinitely until coronavirus is solved. And the Ministry of Defence made it very clear that the team that is working on it has been cut back to an absolute bare minimum. To use military terminology, the main effort has changed. When the main effort changes for the military, you ditch quite a lot of other stuff and you focus on what really matters. The main effort for the UK military is trying to help the country deal with coronavirus and trying to keep basic capabilities going. And given that 1 in 10 of all British servicemen and women are currently in self-isolation, even that latter is very, very difficult. UK Ministry of Defence just doesn't have the ability to walk and chew gum at the same time. And so the Strategic Defence Review, it will probably now be an early 21 issue, if that.
Any parting thoughts and what you guys are going to be focusing on over the coming week?
Yeah, the big topic for me as we're starting to roll into earnings season, and after having lived through 20 years of earnings seasons, this will probably be one of the more interesting ones as companies try to put forth some sort of view on what they think may or may not happen. So that's our key focus, just kind of prepping for earnings, and it starts a little bit this week, and then the following week is sort of a big time in the aerospace defense sector in the US.
I agree with Ron. I think earnings season is going to be fascinating. I just don't think companies are going to have a great deal they can tell us at the moment. One of the refrains that we got from talking around quite a lot of the tier one suppliers and sort of the partners for the aero engine companies and so forth last week was none of the primes are telling us anything. And therefore we, the otherwise very, very large companies don't know a great deal about what's going on. I actually think a lot of the companies will be using earnings season to learn what their customers think, and then to sort of tailor their messages accordingly. I don't think we're going to get a clear view, let alone that wonderfully old-fashioned thing, earnings guidance, probably until Q3.
Richard?
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see whether Boeing follows Airbus with any kind of production guidance, perhaps in tandem with their earnings guidance. We're really just talking about one program because the 737, of course, only one way to go is up, and the plan is still to start building sometime later this year at 20 per month. But the 787 is still, if you're a major subcontractor on the 787, and of course it's one of the most heavily sourced aircraft ever, so there's an awfully big industrial ecosystem around the 787. Your current guidance is still the last guidance, which is 12 per month, which of course is ridiculous. So waiting for guidance on that. It'd be good also to get some guidance on 777, whether that stays at 3 per month or 2 per month, and whether there's any change to 777X. You've already got talk of Lufthansa and Cathay Pacific and maybe others either reconfiguring orders or deferring, and that might be up for a delay, perhaps conceivably. There's so much to wait for in terms of what Boeing says, and Airbus has provided guidance, but it's only provided guidance for about 3 months. It would be good if they gave us some kind of longer term perspective, because there are a lot of people who think it's going to be, 40 per month. That'll be a terrible reduction for 3 months, and then we'll get that V-shaped recovery.
No, I don't. Yeah, Richard, I don't buy that. I mean, I think they were very clear in the statement. It protects them on the downside as well as the upside, i.e., it enables them to cut further. I think the people who think it's all going to go up again in a quarter are, woefully optimistic on this.
Before we go, where do we stand on 737 recertification? Ron, you want to give us kind of a quick walkthrough? Boeing has said that they continue to work successfully with the FAA in order to try to do that. But where are we on this process? Not that it matters all that much, but if you're not doing anything, now would be a good time to get the airplanes certified and actually start to do work on some of those airplanes that people may want to accept delivery of at some point.
Yeah. So, I mean, it looks like the May-June timeframe is when we could get an airworthiness directive out of the FAA. So you get an airworthiness directive out of the FAA May-June, and then you can start shipping airplanes. If the airlines are flying, you'd expect airplanes to be in scheduled service maybe 2 to 3 months after that. There's some training events, obviously, that have to happen with pilots now. Full flight simulator training, so you got to get the pilots to the full flight simulators. That's probably a little bit more complicated now, given the virus lockdowns and all of what that means. But if all goes well, get FAA's airworthiness directive May, June, and then you're in scheduled service 2 to 3 months after that.
Guys, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it as always. Sash, I'm very sorry that you missed an absolutely gorgeous sunset in order to talk to us. So we really appreciate it.
Thanks, Vago.
Great to be here, Vago. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Vago. Great to be on.
And thanks for joining us this week. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DefAero Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report. And check us out on LinkedIn. Look for our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight. Bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.